Hi, I'm Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which brings you the big G for the gospel of Jesus Christ and little g, all the good things that people do to put that gospel of life into action. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had some quality programming over these last 5 years. However, today we have really outdone ourselves. We have a superstar to interview today. This is Professor Robbie George from Princeton University. I first met the professor, I'm sure he doesn't remember me, but I remember him at a Federalist Society meeting in Washington, D.C. And I said to myself, well, we were mere youths at that time, Professor, mere youths. And I remember listening to you. I think you were talking about religious freedom. And I said, oh my gosh, this guy is great. I wish he were a bishop. I think they should make you a bishop. That's how good you are. Not only does he know his stuff, I mean, he's a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University. He's also taught at Harvard University. He's been on a million commissions and committees talking about civil rights. He's talking about bioethics, religious freedom, and he's spoken on abortion and written on abortion, even in journals that you wouldn't expect that they would even print somebody who was against abortion, like, excuse me, folks, I promised I would not use bad words on this show. The New York Times. I said it. Okay, I said it. Now, Professor, we wanted to talk to you especially because of the Supreme Court coming to a decision on what we call the Dodd v. Jackson case. And that's going to come out, we think, in June? Yes? Professor, could you tell us what that case is about?
Any time, but it's most likely to come in June toward the end of the court's term. That's usually, not always, usually when the court hands down the blockbuster decisions of each term.
Okay. Can you tell us about this case so that even people like me can understand it?
Well, first, Father, let me say how grateful I am to you for having me on the show. And in his humility, I should say to viewers, Father doesn't acknowledge how memorable he is. Yes, I do remember meeting many years ago, and we were mere youths at that time. I didn't realize, though, until now that you've let the cat out of the bag that I was at risk of your consecrating me as a bishop. That would have been a grave damage to the church to do something like that. So I'm glad that you stopped, held back from doing that. Yeah, the case out of Mississippi is important, the Jackson case, or it's better known as the Dobbs case. Dobbs against Jackson Women's Health Center. It's important because the court is, for the first time really since the early 1990s, seriously reconsidering its decision in Roe versus Wade, going all the way back 49 years to 1973, with the possibility, I will say the likelihood, I'm going to go out on a limb here, the likelihood that it will actually reverse that misbegotten decision. And if it does that, that will mean that the whole question of protecting the child in the womb, the whole question of regulating abortion, will be shifted back from the judicial to the legislative branches of government. Now the state legislatures and possibly the Congress will again have the constitutional authority to decide, shall we protect the child in the womb or shall we not? What protections, if any, will be given. Now, notice that it won't make abortion illegal. If the court reverses Roe, that will not make abortion illegal. It will not protect a single unborn child. What it will do is restore the power of the people acting through their elected representatives to decide whether and how to protect human life in the womb.
Isn't this what the late Judge Bork said? He said that these issues regarding abortion belong with the states.
Yes, that's right. Or more fundamentally, with the legislative branch, that this is not a matter that the judiciary should resolve. The Judiciary Act, of course, is electorally unaccountable. Nobody elected the U.S. District Court judge for the First District of Louisiana, or the U.S. Court of Appeals judges for the Fourth Circuit, or the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. So Bork's argument was that democratic responsiveness and accountability requires that decisions like this that are not explicitly addressed or in his view, even impliedly addressed in the Constitution, really belong with the legislative branches. Historically, you're right, Father, that historically these matters were left to the states. Abortion regulation was a state matter. There is an interesting question of Congress's authority to legislate in this area, pursuant to some powers that it possesses, especially under the first section of the 14th Amendment. So we'll have to see how it plays out once Roe is reversed, if, as I'm predicting, indeed it is reversed. Of course, I have no crystal ball. It could turn out that I'm completely wrong here.
I hope
you're
completely right.
Reversed, and then we'll see whether Congress is content simply to leave the matter to the states or to take it on as a federal issue, or some aspect of it as a federal issue.
So it would happen, conceivably, could happen, that it would go to Congress and under the 14th Amendment then apply any legislation that they pass to all the states.
Yes, that's right.
Holy cow, I never thought of that one.
Yeah, and it could go in either direction. If there's a pro-life majority in the Congress and in a few years a pro-life president, it could go in a pro-life direction, in the direction of pro-life national legislation. Of course, if there is a Congress and a president on the other side, you could essentially get Roe versus Wade reenacted, not now by judicial fiat, as in the original Roe versus Wade, but by legislative enactment.
Holy cow. Folks, that's why voting is so important. You know, somebody infamous said elections have consequences. They really do. Folks, you got to get out there and vote for the right people. Now, Professor, let's just go back to the Supreme Court. And you said you don't want to look into a crystal ball. You know, I read, and who am I to read the Constitution or any of those things? And I read it and I say, well, it's pretty clear in the 14th Amendment that there's nothing there that says, a woman's entitled to an abortion. I don't say it's not. I don't even know what the penumbras are. It's the Twilight Zone to me. I don't know what it is. Okay, now you have on the court, allegedly, justices who read the Constitution, originalists. And you have some who are more imaginative in their interpretation. Do you see any problems with any of the justices that claim to be conservative, all of a sudden becoming a little more liberal when they come to a conclusion?
Well, 6 of the current justices, the 6 who were nominated by Republican presidents, profess to believe that the Constitution, at least to a very considerable extent, should be interpreted to give effect to the original public meaning of its provisions. That's sometimes called originalism. Now, there are stricter and less strict originalists among those 6. Justice Clarence Thomas is really quite a strict originalist. Chief Justice Roberts, not so strict. But the 6 claim to be originalists. And there is simply no way to read any provisions of the Constitution in a way that would suppose that a so-called right to abortion was part of the original public meaning of the provisions. There just isn't. So there's no basis on originalist grounds for upholding Roe versus Wade. And the reason it's likely to be overturned is precisely that. You now have a solid majority of originalist justices on the court. And if they're true to their originalist principles, and I suspect at least 5 will be, maybe 6 will be, then Roe will be overturned because there's simply no basis for it in originalist approaches to the Constitution. The other 3 justices are almost certain to vote to uphold Roe versus Wade, but they will be in the minority as things are looking.
this concept, though, that you hear people talk about, it's standing law. It's standing law. You think like somebody like Chief Justice Roberts doesn't want to rock the boat. This has been around for 50 years, and we should just leave it alone. Is that conceivable? Well, it's conceivable, but is it wise jurisprudence?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and you're right to raise that question specifically with respect to Chief Justice Roberts. Chief Justice Roberts knows that there's no basis in the original public meaning of constitutional provisions for the idea of a right to abortion. So if he joins the three more liberal members of the court in voting to uphold Roe, and I'm not predicting that he'll do that, but if he does, it will not be on the basis of a claim that Roe versus Wade is justified somehow on originalist grounds. It will be by appeal to precedent. What you just called standing law, what we lawyers call stare decisis, the idea that you should not disturb an established ruling, a well-established ruling, even if the ruling was incorrect, except under strict conditions and for the gravest reasons. Now, stare decisis is a very slippery doctrine, as it's been used by the justices of the Supreme Court and lower court justices over the years. It's hard to discern exactly what the principle or principles are that govern when you invoke stare decisis and uphold an incorrect precedent, and when you disturb it, when you reverse it. Some decisions of the court have been reversed very quickly. In 1943, the Supreme Court reversed itself in the famous flag salute cases. These were cases involving prosecutions, or actually weren't prosecutions, they were expulsions of Jehovah's Witnesses school children from schools, public schools, because the children, on instruction of their parents, refused to salute the flag. The Jehovah's Witnesses regard the flag salute exercise as the worshiping of a graven image. The Supreme Court had originally, only 3 years earlier, upheld the power of schools, public schools, state school boards and so forth, school districts, to require the flag salute and suspend children from school or expel them from school if they refused to salute the flag. They reversed themselves 3 years later. Sometimes very old and well-established precedents have been overturned, most famously Plessy against Ferguson, the late 19th century case that upheld as constitutionally permissible racial segregation, legally mandated racial segregation. That opinion stood for more than half a century, longer than Roe versus Wade, until it was finally reversed by the Supreme Court of the United States in the celebrated 1954 case of Brown against the Topeka Board of Education, declaring de jure, that is legally sanctioned, segregation, racial segregation, to be unconstitutional as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Actually, Father, the Supreme Court has reversed itself something like 200 times over the course of its history in its constitutional rulings. So there would be nothing shocking about the Supreme Court reversing itself. But those who are in the originalist camp who might contemplate upholding Roe will be contemplating doing it as a matter of stare decisis. I think that's basically just Chief Justice Roberts. And if I were predicting, here again, I would predict he's not going to do that, but will actually join the other 5 justices in voting to overturn Roe.
Is there a connection between the rulings of the Supreme Court on abortion and religious freedom? Can you talk about that? Because it seems like a lot of people who are pro-abortion, I'm not saying pro-choice, folks, I'm saying pro-abortion, all right? They also seem to want to in some way limit religious freedom. And I think religious freedom is endangered in this country, and it's certainly being attacked. An awful lot of money is being thrown at the abortion industry. A lot of legislation is being passed by certain administration, who I don't like, to help abort babies. And in the meantime, it's not just about abortion, it is forcing religious organizations to provide money for abortions in like their insurance plans. Professor, could you just run with that?
Well, Father, surely you are not suggesting that there is hypocrisy and bad faith in these efforts to defend, on the one side, a liberty, an alleged liberty, a putative liberty, the liberty to have abortions. On the one side, to defend liberty; on the other side, to destroy liberty by forcing people who, in conscience, including religious organizations, institutions, forcing them against their consciences to participate in or refer to for abortions and so forth. Surely you're not suggesting that there is hypocrisy and bad faith. I mean, that would be like suggesting that there is gambling in Casablanca. And surely, Father, there is no gambling in Casablanca. I would be shocked. Shocked.
Here's looking at you, Professor. As you can imagine, producing this wonderful program, Action for Life, it costs a great deal of money. We're going to need your help. So if you would like to donate to keep this good news program on the air, please go to your computer, your cell phone, actionforlife.net. Thought for the day. A lot of people think that the religion is only for the next world. Well, it's very much for this world too. It has an impact on our daily lives. Make sure that you take time to know the candidates who are running for office and then to vote for those candidates who are pro-life. There are attacks on religious freedom in this country, not just in relationship to abortion and some of the things that the present administration is doing regarding funding for abortion and getting rid of the Helms Amendment and the Hyde Amendment. But, you know, even these cases where, you know, the Colorado baker, the florist, it just goes on and on and on, you know, and I think there's another attempt to take away those people's religious freedoms.
Yeah. Now, it's really important, though, to understand, here's the good news, that the trend on religious freedom is in precisely the right direction. There have been a string of cases over the last decade and a half, consistently expanding the constitutional protections we have for religious freedom. The Supreme Court has been ruling in favor of religious freedom claimants, including in the Colorado Baker case and in the case involving adoption services in Philadelphia, the so-called Fulton case. That was just last term. I expect more victories for the religious freedom side. Many of these victories have been won by the Becket Fund for Religious Freedom. They've got a streak going. They've won 8 Supreme Court decisions expanding religious liberty in a row. Others have been won by the Excellent Alliance for Defending Freedom. I want to mention them as well. I don't want to be biased. I'm on the board of the Becket Fund, so I'm especially proud of the Becket Fund. But our friends over at the Alliance Defending Freedom have also done a good job and won some important cases. The thing that we need to make progress on is persuading the justices to make their rulings in this area a bit broader and more principled. Some of the key rulings, including the Colorado Baker case, have been on quite narrow grounds, which restricts to some extent or limits the precedential value of the decisions. I believe with the latest addition to the court, that's Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who replaces Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we will begin to see some broader rulings. And that will mean that religious freedom will even be more broadly protected. There was a long period of our history with the Supreme Court in which religious freedom was narrowing. Now it is broadening. The trend is in exactly the right direction.
It was, from my reading, a lot of the limitations on religious freedom in this country came about because of anti-Catholicism. Is that true?
Anti-Catholicism was a big factor in some of the early and mid 20th century religion clause cases, both on the free exercise side and on the establishment side, the so-called establishment clause, but especially on that latter. Now, the religion clause, it's really only one clause. There aren't two. We speak of the establishment and the free exercise clauses, but actually there's one religion clause. And here's what it says. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. On the so-called establishment side of that equation, a lot of the court's rulings were meant to restrict the influence and ability to operate of Catholic institutions such as Catholic schools. And of course, this is rooted in anti-immigrant fear, anti-Catholic fear. As the big waves of immigration started to come in especially from Ireland and then Southern and Eastern Europe, and suddenly you get a lot of non-Protestant Christians. You get a lot of Jews, you get a lot of Catholics, you get some Eastern Orthodox Christians. A lot of native-born Protestant Americans were worried that, well, these immigrants don't have our cultural background. They don't have our cultural values. They don't come from democratic religions like Protestantism. They come from hierarchical, authoritarian religions, especially Catholicism. They don't have democratic sensibilities. These sensibilities come with Protestant religious training, but not with Catholic religious training. So what are we going to do to make these immigrant children, especially, good democratic American citizens? Well, we need to, in the opinion of many Protestants at the time, what we need to do is de-Catholicize them. We need to Americanize them, and that meant de-Catholicizing them. Get them into public schools so that they can be taught democratic values and aren't left with the hierarchical authoritarian values of their Catholicism. The state of Oregon passed a statute forbidding private religious schools for children. And that was directed, the Ku Klux Klan was behind it, and it was directed precisely at Catholic education to make sure that Catholic parents couldn't put their kids into parochial schools to be taught Catholic values. The Supreme Court did strike that one down. It did do the right thing in that case. But in some other cases, it would go in the wrong direction. I think a lot of the early Warren Court decisions that were basically hostile to religion were rooted in a fear of too much influence from Catholicism. The worry that Catholicism was something of a threat to democratic values.
Thank you. Now, I have, I'm going to have a loaded question for you now. Maybe not a question. It's kind of, I want, remember I said at the beginning of the show, I think you should have been a bishop? All right. Now.
I'm glad the church was spared that. I'm glad I was spared.
Well, okay, now. We have a problem in our country. A lot of politicians who claim to be devout Catholics are very, very pro-abortion, especially the president and the Speaker of the House. Now, if you were a bishop, how would you handle them?
Well, I would handle them by giving effect to what I would be required to do under canon law, looking at Canon 915, which says that the bishop would be required, really, it's not just optional, to deny communion to anyone who was publicly persisting in manifest grave sin. And that would certainly include the injustice of exposing an entire class of people, whatever their status, because of race or sex or ethnicity or age or size or stage of development or condition of dependency, to the injustice of lethal violence. So it looks to me like an easy case. I mean, you would have to, within your diocese, you would have to call a person who was publicly doing what these politicians are doing and saying what they're saying. You'd have to call them in and say, look, what you're doing is gravely unjust. It's public grave injustice. You're causing grave scandal to the faithful. You're undermining the Church's witness to the sanctity of human life, and you're guilty of grave injustice against the victims, the tiny unborn victims. So unless you are willing to cease and desist from this manifest grave sin, you are not permitted to receive communion in this diocese. It'd be pretty straightforward, and I would instruct my priests that I was giving effect to canon law.
Now, Bishop George, why do you think your brother bishops are not doing what you are telling us should be done?
Well, part of the reason, I think, is that some very good bishops fear that it would do more harm than good, that it would be perceived by the general public as an improper effort by the bishops to intrude themselves into politics. It would cause a backlash. It would generate more support rather than less support for the politicians. So they're doing something of a consequentialist calculation here and saying, well, the likely consequences of doing it would actually harm the pro-life cause, and I don't want to do that. So it's better for me to just silently pray for the politicians, or in my own speeches contradict them, or speak to them privately, but without doing anything publicly and without instructing my priests, parish priests, not to give them communion. I think that's probably the reasoning of some good bishops.
We are running out of time, Professor. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's always wonderful to see you, to hear you, to read what you write. I know you're for action, I'm for action, and I hope you are too. We would like to thank our generous sponsors for their wonderful support. Thanks for watching. Please join us next time for Action for Life. I'm for action, and I hope you are too. I'm Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ, the big G, and the little g, all the good things that people are doing to put the gospel of life into action. So please join us for the next episode of Action for Life.